I'm Dr. Christy Gibson, and this is a book review series. I read all the books, so you don't necessarily have to, but I want to describe some of my favorites and the most important ones. So we're going to start the series with Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery. This, to me, was one of the most important seminal books around trauma that helped me understand not just what it was, but what could be done about it. And I really appreciated that she was writing back in the 80s, and she took a very feminist perspective, which was quite different than the other writings at the time. And she's also continued this perspective. So more recently, in the 2020s, her next book described a fourth stage of trauma process work around justice. And you can totally see that she's heading in that direction through this book because of her feminist perspective. So I have earmarked this book and highlighted this book, and I'm just going to share with you some of the most important things that I noticed so that you could decide if it's something you want to pick up or just to give you kind of the Coles notes or the highlights. So she starts with the history of trauma and psychoanalytic theory. So first she describes how Freud, he was eliciting these horrific stories of abuse from these young women and initially believing them, helping them process their pain. But then when he faced a backlash from like aristocracy, he's like, oh no, this didn't actually happen to them and their families. It was a fantasy they had. So it's one of those places where you can understand just how the psychological industry or like the history of psychology has constantly caused harm to communities placed at risk. So back here, we're talking about women in particular, but I just think it's important to notice the roots. We're not particularly feminist. And a lot of us still might use psychoanalytic theory or still might study Freud, and there's some problematic history there. She talks a little bit about other folks in the trauma field from these times. So she talks about the way that they were describing trauma. So the psychological associations describing it as outside of the range of human experience, where she was arguing actually it's well within human experience. It's quite common. It's something that happens to lots of us. And then she described how Janet, who was another one of the pioneers, really talked about the key element being a sense of helplessness. And what I loved about when she was talking about specific kinds of folks who've been through trauma, she talked about the different ways that they could experience a sense of power in part of their healing process. So she speaks about people who became workers for advocacy or victim rights workers. But I think you can also enact a sense of power within the session, which can also help relieve that sense of helplessness and hopelessness that happened at the time of the event. She talks a lot in her second chapter about a dichotomy and a lack of balance. And what she's really describing in today's language, we might use polyvagal theory, but she talks about the underactive or the numb and dissociated response. And then she talks about the overactive, what we call fight and flight, or this lots of flooding and intense, overwhelming feelings. So she does describe that this is part of that nervous system response, which to me is describing that this could be the best doorway in because those two responses, from what I understand of neurobiology, are reflexive. They're not necessarily something under conscious control. She speaks a lot about the different relational patterns that can happen that have to do with meaning and how they might express themselves. So I think of this as, the way that a family might all experience the events that happened in their childhood in different ways as adults, or people who survive a natural disaster may have different responses to that. So she describes very specific ones around feeling attached to the abuser, fragmentation, dependency, codependency, a lot of physical symptoms that can happen, this self-soothing that needs to take place, which she also describes things like self-mutilation as soothing. So I think she really helped me understand how all of these relational patterns to both self and other are inherently protective. And that's a really core message that I got in this book, which helped me quite quickly depathologize trauma and recognize that it was a normal response to abnormal situations. She describes complex PTSD. So, chapter 121, she has a beautiful full page definition that I won't get into, but this was really, I'll speak to pieces of it. So, she talks about alterations in affect regulation, in consciousness and self perception, in perception of the perpetrator, in relationships, and in systems of meaning. And I think this is really missing from the DSM, is her definition of complex trauma. It's something that I've held ever since I read this. Other key highlights that I thought were important in my later practice included the sense of shame and self-loathing. So part of the resolution that must happen is change to that sense of self so that we can learn some self-compassion. Lots of work from other folks in that regard. And she mentions refugee health, which I thought was really cool because that's where I am working. And she talks about different ways that we can take power back in both the therapy and in real life situations. She gives lots of concrete examples of different ways that that might happen and some of the survivors that she's worked with. And she describes effectiveness of different kinds of therapies that were around back in the 80s. So this, it's 2025, 6 right now. We're just on the cusp. And so this is a book that's been around for a long time and it still holds up. The key takeaway for me was the 3 stages of trauma treatment. She describes establishing safety, which I interpret as a lot of safety in the nervous system, but also how can you feel safe when the trauma feels ongoing? The second stage she calls remembrance and mourning. So this is where the trauma processing happens and you remember those memories in new ways and you actually do the process work. And the third stage is where we do more integration. So it's resourcing, and I think it's really resolving your source of meaning and purpose and the way that you interpret your journey in the world. So Trauma and Recovery, seminal book, totally recommend.